The wind was sharp that evening, brushing through the long golden grass like a whisper from the heavens. Jacob Hart stood at the edge of his ranch, his boots pressed into the dry earth that had been both his companion and his cage for years. The land stretched endlessly around him, open, untamed, and aching with silence. He had grown used to that silence, used to the rhythm of solitude. The sound of the wind, the distant call of coyotes, the creak of his barn door. Those had been his music. But tonight, that silence carried something heavier. Expectation. He leaned against the weathered fence post, running a calloused thumb over the smooth wood. His horse, Dusty, grazed nearby, occasionally lifting her head as if sensing her master's unease. The sun was slipping low, painting the sky in molten colors of orange and crimson, and Jacob's heart pounded harder with every passing second. She was supposed to arrive today. Clara. He had repeated her name in his mind 1,000 times like a prayer, a melody, a promise. The woman he had never met, yet somehow knew better than anyone. For almost a year, their letters had been his lifeline. Each word from her felt like a spark in the darkness of his lonely existence. She had written about her laughter, about her dreams of open skies and how she longed to see a world unbroken by walls. She said she was tired of crowded cities, of people who looked but never saw. She wanted peace, simplicity, a man who worked the land with his hands and heart. Jacob had written back, telling her about his ranch, the small cabin he'd built with his own hands, the fields that stretched for miles, the way the stars looked like diamonds scattered by God himself. He'd told her about his loneliness too, though not in so many words. "It's quiet here," he had written once. "Quiet enough that sometimes I think I can hear my own heart talking back." Her reply had come 2 weeks later. "Then I'll come and listen with you." And so he had waited. The last letter she sent had been short, only a few lines, written in a firm but elegant hand. "I'll be there on the 15th, wait for me." That was all. No more letters after that. No explanations. Just that promise. And Jacob, the man who had spent years learning not to expect anything from anyone, found himself believing again. He had spent the week preparing. The old cabin had never looked better. He fixed the porch railing that had been loose for months, mended the roof where the rain used to sneak in, and even carved a small wooden sign by the door that read, "Welcome home." He had never been the kind to believe in sentimentality, but something about her letters made him want to try, to soften the edges of the life he'd built with grit and silence. He had picked wildflowers that morning, yellow sunbursts and pale purple blooms that grew along the creek. They weren't fancy, but they were honest, like the land itself. He placed them carefully in a jar on the porch, and for the first time in years, he lit a lantern before sunset. Now, as the shadows lengthened, he stood there waiting. Every sound seemed amplified. The flutter of wings in the barn loft, the rustle of grass, the distant cry of a hawk. He kept glancing toward the dirt road that wound through the valley, the road she would come down. His heart lifted every time he thought he heard wheels on gravel, then sank again when the sound turned out to be the wind. Time dragged. The sun dipped below the horizon and the first star appeared. He leaned his elbows on the fence and took a slow breath. Maybe her wagon had broken down. Maybe she was delayed. The roads were rough and travelers sometimes lost their way out here. He told himself she'd come by morning. But beneath the hope, a cold unease began to stir. The land around him had always been unpredictable, sometimes beautiful, sometimes cruel. And beyond the hills lay territories that few white settlers dared to cross. The locals whispered about the tribes who roamed those lands, proud people who had lived there long before the fences and the farms. Jacob had always respected them, never raised a gun unless he had to, and kept to his side of the world. He had even traded with a few once, meat for furs, tobacco for tools. But still, there were stories. And tonight, as the air grew colder and the stars brighter, those stories began to creep into his thoughts. He shook them off and turned his eyes back to the road. The lantern light flickered across his face, deepening the lines of a man who had lived too long without laughter. He thought about the first letter he had sent to Clara, how awkward his handwriting had been, how clumsy his words felt. "I'm not a man of many things," he'd written, "but what I have I'll share, my land, my fire, and my truth." She had told him that was enough. He could still remember one of her last letters. the one that made him smile for days. You sound like the kind of man who still believes the earth can be kind. Maybe that's what I've been searching for. Someone who doesn't just take from it, but listens. He had laughed when he read that, sitting on the porch with Dusty beside him. Listening to the earth, he had muttered. That's all I ever do, woman. But deep down he'd felt something shift. Like his quiet, forgotten world had been noticed at last. Hours passed. The moon climbed high, washing the plains in silver light. Jacob lit another lantern and hung it by the gate, hoping it might guide her wagon through the darkness. His mind began to drift between hope and worry, memory and imagination. He thought of how it would be when she arrived, her stepping down from the wagon, her eyes meeting his for the first time. Would she be shy? Would she smile? Would she think him too rough, too old, too plain? He exhaled a shaky breath and laughed softly to himself. You're overthinking, Hart, he muttered. She's coming. You just wait. Then, as if the earth had been waiting for him to say it, he felt it. A tremor beneath his boots. Faint, rhythmic, distant. He frowned and turned toward the horizon. The sound was low at first, like thunder far away, but it grew, steady and deliberate. The ground began to vibrate, the lantern's flame flickering wildly. Jacob's heart raced. That wasn't thunder. It was hooves, hundreds of them. He grabbed his rifle from the porch and stepped out into the open, squinting into the distance. The night air pulsed with the sound of horses, powerful, fast, relentless. A cloud of dust rose along the far ridge, illuminated by the moonlight. Shapes began to form within it. Riders, many riders. The rhythmic pounding filled the valley, echoing through the plains like a drumbeat of the earth itself. Jacob's breath caught. He knew what this was. They came like a storm, 400 strong, painted in colors that gleamed under the moon. The warriors' cries carried through the night, fierce and haunting. Jacob froze, torn between fear and disbelief. His first instinct was to raise his rifle, but his hands trembled. What good would one man's gun do against 400 riders? For a moment his thoughts darted wildly. Why here? Why tonight? His eyes flicked to the lantern still burning by the gate, the flowers on the porch, the sign that read, "Welcome home." And suddenly a chill ran through him, deeper than fear. This wasn't coincidence. This was something else. He backed slowly toward the cabin, his eyes never leaving the riders as they drew nearer. The sound of hooves grew deafening now, vibrating through his chest, through the ground beneath him. The warriors were close enough that he could see the feathers in their hair, the glint of metal in their hands, the paint on their faces. But then, just as quickly as it began, the noise changed. The front line of riders slowed. The others followed. The thunder of hooves faded into a heavy silence. 400 warriors sat on their horses in a wide semicircle, encircling his land. Their eyes, dark and unreadable, fixed on him. Jacob's breath came in short bursts. He felt every muscle in his body tighten, ready to fight or flee, though he knew neither would do much good. Then one of them stepped forward. A tall man, broad-shouldered, with long black hair that glistened under the moonlight. His face was painted in red and black, his eyes fierce yet calm. He carried a spear unlike any Jacob had ever seen, carved with symbols and feathers that danced in the night breeze. The man stopped his horse a few feet from the fence. The two men stared at each other in silence, the weight of the night pressing between them. Finally, the warrior spoke, his voice deep, calm, carrying the rhythm of the plains. You wait for the woman? Jacob's throat tightened. He swallowed hard and managed a nod, his voice barely steady. I'm waiting. The warrior studied him for a moment longer, then slowly dismounted. The rest of the riders remained silent, watching. Jacob's pulse hammered in his ears. He didn't understand. Not yet. The man stepped closer, stopping just at the edge of the lantern's light. His gaze softened slightly, though his stance remained proud, powerful. She is our daughter, he said. The words hit Jacob like a gust of wind that stole the breath from his chest. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. His eyes flicked past the warrior, to the sea of faces behind him. And there, among them, a small figure emerged. She moved with quiet grace, her long dark hair braided and adorned with shells that shimmered faintly in the lantern's glow. Her dress was simple white cloth flowing like moonlight, and her eyes were the same shade he'd imagined every time he read her letters. Jacob, she whispered, her voice trembling, carried by the night wind. I told them about you. The rifle slipped from his hand and hit the dirt. His world, once so empty, so simple, had just changed forever. Jacob didn't move. The air around him seemed to thicken, pressing against his lungs, stealing every breath he tried to take. The woman in white stood at the center of a vast circle of warriors, her dark braids glinting in the moonlight, her face calm but unreadable. She was real, flesh and blood standing before him after all those months of words written on fragile paper. But she wasn't the woman he had pictured in his quiet, lonely mind. No pale hands, no bonnet, no city dress. She was something else entirely, something wild, ancient, and powerful. Her name left his lips in a whisper that barely carried through the wind. Clara? Her gaze met his, steady and searching, as though she wanted to be sure he was the same man who had written those letters, the man she had come to know without ever hearing his voice. Her lips trembled as she stepped forward, the white fabric of her dress brushing against the dust. The warriors around her didn't move, but Jacob could feel their watchful eyes burning into him. The tall man, the one who had called her his daughter, remained still, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his spear. Jacob swallowed hard, trying to find words. But everything that came to mind felt too small, too foolish for the moment. What could he possibly say? That he didn't know? That he hadn't expected her to be this? You waited, she said softly, and even from that distance her voice carried like music over the plains. I did, he managed to say, his voice rough from the dust and disbelief. Didn't think you'd bring an army with you, though. A faint smile ghosted over her lips, but her eyes never left his. They came because they loved me, because they feared what I might find. Jacob's gaze flicked toward the man beside her, the one she had called father. The chief it had to be. The man's expression was carved in stone, unreadable yet heavy with meaning. Jacob knew that kind of look. It was the same one he wore when something he cared about stood in danger. The chief stepped closer, the soft thud of his moccasins on dirt almost inaudible. The other warriors shifted slightly, their horses snorting, restless under the moonlight. Jacob felt his palms dampen, his body tense. He had lived through storms, wildfires, and winters that could kill a man, but this was different. You write to her, the chief said, his English steady but touched by an accent that carried the cadence of the land. You speak of love, of marriage. His tone wasn't angry, but every word carried the weight of judgment. Jacob hesitated. Yes, I wrote. He forced himself to straighten, his voice steadying. But I didn't know. The chief raised a hand, cutting him off. You did not know who she is. It wasn't a question, and Jacob couldn't deny it. He nodded slowly. No, I thought she was someone else. For the first time, Clara's expression softened. I never lied, she said, stepping closer. I told you I live beyond the frontier. I told you I belong to the earth more than to the cities. You did, Jacob admitted, his chest tightening. But I didn't understand what that meant. The chief's gaze shifted between them. Many men from your kind cross these lands, he said. Some bring guns. Some bring lies. Some bring sickness. His eyes hardened, narrowing. You bring words. Jacob could feel the accusation beneath the surface. Not lies, he said quickly. Never lies. I meant every word I wrote. Then why are you afraid? The chief asked. Jacob blinked, caught off guard. He wasn't sure how to answer. Was he afraid? Maybe. Not of the man standing before him, but of what his presence meant. The ground beneath him, the world he thought he knew, was shifting. He lowered his rifle to the ground slowly, showing his empty hands. I'm not afraid, he said quietly. I'm just trying to understand. The chief studied him for a long moment, then turned slightly toward Clara. She met her father's eyes, something unspoken passing between them. Then she looked back at Jacob. My father wanted to see the man who spoke of love without knowing who I was, she said softly. He wanted to see if such a man could be true. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. The silence that followed was heavy but alive. The night seemed to listen. He looked around at the warriors, each one watching him like a hawk, every muscle coiled and ready. They weren't there for talk. They were there to protect, and yet none had drawn a weapon. Then he seen me, Jacob said, meeting the chief's gaze. Just a man. Nothing more. But I meant what I wrote to her. He turned to Clara again. Every word. I said I'd build her a life. I said I'd wait, and I did. The chief's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Respect, perhaps, or curiosity. You would marry her still, he said. Jacob's voice was quiet but firm. If she'd have me? The chief's brow furrowed. Even if she is not what you dreamed? Jacob hesitated, his throat tightening. He looked at Clara, at her calm strength, the way her presence seemed to fill the open space around them, the wild grace in her eyes. She wasn't what he had imagined. She was something far greater. I didn't come looking for a dream, he said slowly. I came looking for something real. Clara took another step forward, her bare feet brushing the dry earth. You don't know what real means out here, she said. My people live with the land. We don't own it. We belong to it. Can you belong to it too? Her words hung in the air, soft yet sharp. The warriors murmured among themselves in their language. The sound like wind in tall grass. Jacob looked around, at the wide plains stretching endlessly under the moon, at the land he'd worked and lived on for years. I've belonged to this land my whole life, he said quietly. It's taken more from me than I can count, but I've never left it. So yeah, I belong. Her eyes glimmered with something, maybe understanding, maybe hope. The chief nodded slowly. You speak with honesty. That is good, but words are easy when the heart is soft. What will you do when the world turns against you for this? Jacob's jaw tightened. The world's already turned its back on me once. I've lived through worse. The chief's gaze lingered on him, measuring, testing. You think you understand loneliness, he said, but you have not yet stood between two worlds. Clara looked at her father, then at Jacob. That's what I've done, she said softly. All my life. Between my people and yours. Between peace and fear. Jacob took a cautious step closer to her. The circle of warriors tensed but didn't move. Then maybe we don't have to stand on different sides anymore. The chief's expression remained unreadable. The moonlight caught the edges of his features, casting deep shadows over his face. You think one man and one woman can change what has been broken for generations? Jacob hesitated. Then he said quietly, No, but maybe we can start. For the first time, the chief's stern mask cracked. His lips twitched just slightly into something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't scorn either. You speak like a fool, he said. Jacob's grin was faint but genuine. Been called worse. The silence that followed was long, stretching across the vast open night. The horses shifted, snorting softly, their breath forming clouds in the cool air. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its cry rising and fading across the plains. Then, to Jacob's surprise, Clara's father stepped forward again. He held out his hand, palm open. If you lie to her, he said, his tone solemn. If you hurt her spirit, I will know. The earth will tell me. Jacob looked at the offered hand. It was strong, scarred and steady, the hand of a leader, of a father. He hesitated only a moment before reaching out and gripping it firmly. Then I reckon I'd better make sure I don't, he said. The chief's eyes flickered with something like approval. Good. He released Jacob's hand and turned to his daughter. You will stay here tonight. We return at sunrise. Clara nodded, bowing her head slightly. Yes, father. He gave her one last look, part warning, part blessing, before stepping back toward his horse. The other warriors followed, forming a loose circle again. They didn't leave yet, but the tension in the air eased slightly, like a storm beginning to drift away. Jacob watched as the chief mounted his horse with smooth, practiced ease. Before turning away, he said quietly, Do not mistake her heart for weakness. It is stronger than yours, Jacob nodded. I believe it. The chief looked at him one last time, then signaled to his men. The warriors began to move, their horses pacing slowly in a wide circle that faded into the night. Only a few stayed behind, distant silhouettes keeping watch on the horizon. For a moment, the world was still again. The dust settled, the stars glowed brighter, and the only sounds were the crackle of the lantern flame and the faint rustle of the grass. Jacob turned to Clara. She stood by the fence now, her fingers brushing the rough wood, her face unreadable. You should have told me, he said quietly, that you were, you know. She tilted her head slightly. Would it have changed the way you wrote to me? He hesitated, then shook his head. No, but maybe I'd have written faster. A soft laugh escaped her lips, light and genuine. Then I'm glad I didn't. For the first time since she'd arrived, Jacob smiled fully. The tension that had coiled in his chest began to loosen. Clara looked out across the plains, her eyes distant. They don't trust easily, she said. My father wanted to make sure you were real. I'm about as real as dirt, Jacob said. She looked at him, smiling faintly. That's what I hoped. The night wind brushed through her hair, and for a moment everything seemed to still. The stars above them, the fields around them, even the heartbeat in Jacob's chest. He stepped closer, close enough that he could see the faint shimmer of tears in her eyes. You came, he said softly. That's what matters. I told you I would, she whispered. And my people keep their word. Jacob nodded, his voice low. So do I. They stood there in silence, the night wrapping around them like a living thing. Behind them, the warriors waited in the shadows. Before them stretched the endless land, the same land that had separated them, now binding them together. Somewhere deep inside, Jacob understood that this was no simple love story. This was something bigger, much fragile, uncertain, and dangerous. But as Clara reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his, he knew he would face whatever came next. And for the first time in years, the quiet of the plains no longer felt empty. It felt alive. The night air was thick with tension, though no weapons were raised and no voices were loud. The air between Jacob, Clara, and her father was heavier than any battle smoke, thick with unspoken things, with pride, with fear, and with the slow unfolding of something fragile. The warriors stood in a half-circle around the cabin, their horses restless, hooves pawing at the dirt as though they, too, could sense that something sacred was taking place here. The chief's gaze burned through the quiet. His face was hard as stone, carved by years of command and burden. You say you love her, he said, his tone calm but his voice carrying the authority of 100 ancestors. Even if she belongs to another world? Jacob felt the words land deep in his chest. He wanted to answer fast, but this wasn't a question to be rushed. The man standing before him wasn't just any father. He was a leader, a protector, the keeper of his people's bloodline and honor. Jacob took a breath, let it out slow, and met the man's eyes. I don't rightly know what world I belong to anymore, Jacob said, voice rough and steady. But I know what I feel when I look at her, and I reckon that's enough. A low murmur rippled through the line of warriors. It wasn't anger, not yet, but surprise, the way men react when someone says something that dares to stand between courage and foolishness. The chief studied him for a long moment. Many men speak of love, he said finally, but their love is like smoke. It rises, it fades, it disappears when the wind blows hard. Jacob swallowed, then took a small step forward. Then I guess we'll find out what kind mine is. Clara's eyes flicked between them, filled with a quiet fire. She stepped closer to Jacob, her voice trembling with emotion but steady in truth. Father, she said softly, I told you what he wrote to me. I told you he never once spoke down to me, never asked me to leave who I was behind. He just spoke like a man who saw more than himself. Her father's expression softened, but only slightly. You told me many things, he said, his voice gentler now. You said he made you laugh. You said his words carried warmth like a hearth in winter. But you also said he is a man of the settlers, the same kind who take the rivers, the trees, the graves of our people. His tone hardened again, every syllable cutting clean through the air. How can I trust that he will not take you too? The question hit Jacob deep. He had no rehearsed answer, no fine speech. He didn't even know if there were words strong enough to bridge the centuries of anger that hung between their worlds. But he knew truth. Truth was the only thing he'd ever had. I won't take her from anything, he said finally. I'd give up this land before I'd ask her to change who she is. She's not mine to take. I'm just a man who waited for her because something in her letters told me she was the only soul who still listened to the wind the way I do. A hush fell over the circle. The wind itself seemed to pause, as if even it were waiting for the next breath. Clara looked at her father, her eyes glistening in the firelight. I told you, she whispered. He understands the land. The chief said nothing for a long time. He turned away, walking a few paces toward the open plain, his silhouette stark against the moonlit horizon. The wind tugged gently at his cloak of fur and beads. He seemed to be speaking to the earth itself before he spoke again. You do not understand what you ask, he said, not turning around. Our worlds have been divided by more than rivers. My people have buried their sons because of men who look like you. They have watched fires consume our villages, watched treaties written and broken. You bring promises now, but promises are not peace. Jacob felt shame tighten in his throat. He had never fought against them, but he carried the same skin, the same face as the men who had. He couldn't argue that. "I can't change what's been done," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "But I can choose what I do now. And I choose her." The chief turned back, his eyes unreadable. "And if choosing her means choosing us?" Jacob met his gaze without hesitation. "Then I'll choose that too." That time the chief did not speak right away. He studied Jacob, searching for weakness, for deceit, for the easy lie of a desperate man. But Jacob's stare didn't falter. He didn't plead or beg. He just stood there, tall, still, worn by years of work and loneliness, a man of soil and scars. Finally the chief stepped closer, until they were face to face. The two men stood within arm's reach, the firelight flickering across their faces, one carved by the wind, the other by time. "You would give up your people?" the chief asked quietly. Jacob shook his head. "I ain't got much of a people left. I've been alone a long time." The chief's eyes softened slightly. There was no pity there, only understanding. "Loneliness can be a strong wind," he said. "It pushes men into strange places." "Maybe so," Jacob said. "But sometimes it pushes them toward what they were always meant to find." He looked at Clara then, and the quiet in his voice was full of something unbreakable. "It pushed me to her." Clara's breath trembled. She looked at him, then at her father. "He speaks truth," she whispered. "I've heard lies all my life. His words are not lies." Her father's shoulders lowered slightly. The fury that had once burned in his stance faded into something like weariness. He looked at his daughter, the fierce love in his eyes clear even through his stern expression. "I have protected you from many things," he said to her. "From hunger, from storms, from the cruelty of those who would use your kindness as a weapon. I have fought to keep your spirit free." He looked back at Jacob. "If this man breaks it, there will be no mercy. Do you understand this?" Jacob nodded without flinching. "I do. And yet you still say you love her?" "I do." The chief stared at him for another long moment. Then slowly he lifted his hand and pointed to the earth beneath their feet. "Then swear it to this ground," he said. "Swear it not to me, not to her, but to the land that made her. The land that carries our dead and our stories." Jacob hesitated only a second before he knelt, pressing his hand against the dirt. It was cool, rough, familiar. The same soil he'd worked for years, the same ground that had fed him and taken from him in equal measure. He looked up at the chief, his hand still touching the earth. "I swear," he said quietly, "as long as this land breathes, I won't break what's been given to me." A hush fell again. The warriors exchanged glances, murmuring low in their own tongue. The chief said nothing for a long while. Then he nodded, slow and solemn. "Then no blood will be spilled tonight," he said. Clara let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her father turned to her, his voice quieter now. "You have chosen your path," he said, "and I will not stand in your way. But know this, peace is not found by walking away from who you are. Remember where you come from." "I will," she said softly. He gave her a long, searching look, then placed his hand gently on her shoulder. The gesture of a father who knows his child is no longer a child. He turned away, signaling to the warriors that the night's standoff was over. They began to mount their horses one by one, silent as ghosts, the sound of leather and hooves breaking the stillness. Jacob stood there, still half stunned, as Clara's father approached his horse. Before mounting, the chief turned back once more. "You waited for her," he said quietly. "That means something. In my world, patience is the truest test of a man's heart." Jacob nodded. "Then maybe my heart's finally past something." For the first time, the faintest flicker of a smile touched the chief's face, brief and fleeting, like sunlight breaking through clouds. He climbed onto his horse and looked down at Jacob. "You will see us again," he said. "If your word breaks, you will see us sooner." "I don't plan on breaking it," Jacob said. The chief nodded once. Then he gave a sharp call in his own language, and the warriors began to move. The sound of hundreds of hooves filled the night once more, but this time it wasn't thunder. It was rhythm, the sound of life, of departure, of something ancient shifting in the wind. Clara watched them ride off until they were only shadows melting into the horizon. Her father looked back once, raising a hand, a silent blessing or warning. Jacob couldn't tell which. And then he was gone. For a while, neither Jacob nor Clara spoke. The fire crackled quietly between them, throwing long shadows across the cabin. The moon hung high and bright, bathing everything in silver. Finally, Jacob exhaled and gave a soft, incredulous laugh. "Well," he said, "that's one hell of a way to meet the in-laws." Clara smiled faintly, shaking her head. "You shouldn't joke," she said, but there was laughter trembling in her voice. "I don't know what else to do," Jacob admitted. "I was ready to get shot a few minutes ago." She stepped closer, the glow of the fire catching in her eyes. "You were brave," she said quietly. He shrugged, looking down at the dirt. "Bravery's just what's left when you ain't got any other choice." For a long moment, they stood there in silence. The world around them felt bigger now, alive, awake, and listening. Clara's fingers brushed against his arm, tentative but sure. He looked at her, and in that instant, every lonely night, every unanswered prayer, every quiet dawn he'd spent waiting felt like it had led to this moment. "I thought I was waiting for a woman," he said softly. "Didn't realize I was waiting for a whole world to show up with her." She smiled, her hand finding his. "Now you have both." He squeezed her hand gently, his heart steady for the first time in years. In the distance, the faint echo of drums lingered on the wind. Not a threat, but a promise. A reminder. The night was far from over, but something inside him knew he wasn't waiting anymore.